So you told me previously that obviously your view was different back in the 50s and 60s. You gave me a bit of a background as to how things were at the time, how the media was very much restricted, and Israel was viewed in a very positive manner. And then you had all of these changes after the peace treaty, after the 90s, and after the internet obviously came along. We started to have more access for information.
Yes.
And obviously social media changed everything. What happened to you particularly in the past 5 months since this genocide began?
Well, my concern for the Palestinians has been growing over the years.
So before even the last war?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was able to follow some of it up through the Lebanese incursion in 2006. But even up to that point, they're really, Israel is considered a very positive situation in the United States. But that was the first time Israel was really given a bloody nose by it's a non-state actor, but they are representing the Lebanese people in their role. But all through the years, little by little, the more I was able to read documents and what have you on the subject, I was able to get a much better view of what's going on in the Israeli region, region where Israel is. The thing that startled me most is how they think. I mean, a lot of people have read Israel Shahak's. He has 2 books out. One is called I think the 7th Million or 3,000 Years or Together or something like that. And the other one is the one I read, which was Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. Jewish fundamentalism in Israel is a frightening look at how Israelis, especially fundamentalist Jews, look at things. And you have the ultra-Orthodox Jews that are in Israel that are against the state of Israel because of a religious conviction. But then you have all these right-winged fundamentalist Jews that are like the equivalent of evangelical Christians in the United States, where they interpret that the Bible is they're the chosen people, they have the right to the land and what have you, and that they're just going to promote that type of situation. And as you've been reporting recently, the actual religious ultra-Orthodox people in Israel, they don't even want to serve in the army because it's not part of their
identity. No, not at all. Yeah. And there's a big difference that some people don't understand between the ultra-Orthodox community and the Zionist religious community. The ultra-Orthodox community in Israel is split into the Sfaradim, they call them, or more the Easterners, and the Ashkenazim, which is the Ashkenazi Jews that came from Europe. Both of them have their own ultra-Orthodox religious leaderships in Israel, but they share a lot of similarities when it comes to their view of religion. Now, don't get me wrong, they obviously have some sort of influence from Zionism itself, because obviously you're living in Israel. But the difference between them and the religious Zionist type people in the West Bank is that the others, you don't feel any ounce of any sort of religion from them, really. Firstly, the traditional costume is different. They wear differently. They are only about racism, these people. Whereas the ultra-Orthodox community, you'll see them passionate about things to do with like the religious duties, the religious obligations, men and women, right? Keeping the Shabbat. And that also, some of it is also linked to the religious Zionist community. But when you talk about the religious Zionists, you bring people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich.
Well, actually, there's sort of a reason in part for that, other than indoctrination. Back in the 1960s, when we met Israelis, we would wonder why they weren't religious. They said, we don't have to be religious, we're living the religion. Well, I don't think an ultra-Orthodox religious Jew would accept that. But I imagine that's how this ultra-right-winged Messianic Zionist Jew came about. They basically secular Jews.
Yeah. And they have a big problem with that. But that's part of Zionism, isn't it? I mean, Zionism, really the idea started gaining momentum back in the mid 19th century. Before that, you had Christian movements who promoted Jewish people migrating to Palestine, right?
Well,
Gained a lot of...
if I can just interrupt, up until 1897, it was basically a proto-Zionist movement. People were going to Israel, but not in the numbers that would follow later. But these people weren't interested in the state. They were Jews, but they had no interest in the state. They wanted to live in Israel, like with the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Jews, in harmony there. They weren't interested in building a formal political state. That didn't really come about until Herzl brought together mostly Ashkenazi Jews to the World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And the Proto-Zionists, as they were called, they didn't have any real influence over this event, and they were literally overwhelmed by the Russian crowd led by
Jabotinsky, yeah. I mean, they struggled to have ultra-Orthodox Jews supporting them, by the way, in the beginning of the 20th century. And I'm not sure if you recall, when the Zionist movement had conferences in the US, the ultra-Orthodox community were protesting in tens of thousands against the idea of Zionism. But Zionism as a movement started to convince some in the ultra-Orthodox community with the idea of you can establish a Jewish state before the arrival of the Messiah, according to their belief, and religious Jews can live them. Some of them obviously followed suit, but the majority did not. And that's very evident to this day with the ultra-Orthodox community inside of Israel. And you're seeing a massive shift, obviously, outside. I mean,
right.
I have never seen, in previous conflicts at least, the numbers of Jewish people who are so vocal against Israel. I mean, in America, you have movements led by Jewish groups on their own in many cases.
Yeah, Jewish Voices.
I'm sorry. Voices
Jewish,
for Peace.
Yeah, it's a major movement.
Yeah, and Jewish Voices for Peace, yeah.
And they were sort of a backwater type of activist group until Gaza. Now they're shutting down places all over the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's very important because, you know, many people link like the Judaism with Zionism, and obviously there are links. Not like there are no links. There are no links really, but I think it's important to highlight that Zionism is a neo-colonial ideology, really, a violent neo-colonial ideology that's using Judaism as a front and is ethnicizing Judaism. That's why, like you said, we're living the religion, right? They started telling they started telling people that you are Jewish ethnically, right? So when they needed more Jewish people to come to Israel for demographic purposes back in the 50s, and they started to bring the Jewish Arabs from Arab countries, and by the way, in many cases, committing terrorist activities in those countries to instill fear in the Jewish communities to migrate to Israel, right? When they came, they started telling them, you're not Arab, you're Jewish. And they changed their names. They didn't let them live their kind of Arab life inside of Israel. They told them you're Jewish from now on, which just proves really that they're using this identity as a political tool, like other religions really did use religion as a political tool, in
Well,
my opinion.
in Israel, there's no, on their passports, there's no national identity as Israeli. At least there hasn't been. And you're either labeled Jewish or Arab,
Mm.
even though you're a citizen of Israel. There's no Israeli national identity in that respect.
Well, that's why it's an ethno-religious supremacist state, because there's one rule for Jewish people and there was one rule for Arab people. I mean, in 2018, they introduced the nation-state law. The
Yes.
nation-state law stated that Israel belongs to the Jewish people. It doesn't belong to everyone else inside it.
The shame of it is that Israel could have been a cooperating member of the Arab nations and help build tremendous capabilities in that region. Talk about
I think so too.
opportunity
Yeah.
lost.
Mm.
It wasn't going to happen with the type of attitudes that were coming into.
No, I think so if the approach prior to the establishment of Israel was different, but that wasn't the case. That wasn't the plan from the beginning. The plan from the beginning was to create a state that's a front for neocolonial powers, primarily, obviously, the US, because, okay, it was given by the British Empire at the time, but then the US took over this empire international status from Britain and continued, because, like, I argued that if, let's say, many Jewish people started to immigrate to Palestine post-World War II, but they started to immigrate for purposes to merge in the community and cooperate within the community and create a multicultural state, because it was always a multicultural, multi-religious country, Palestine. Jewish people lived there.
The Jews that came out of the Holocaust in Europe who did emigrate to Palestine weren't treated very well by the existing population. They were actually looked down upon as weak, which didn't make much sense, but there have been many documents of showing that type of treatment of these people. And even the Jews from Africa, not that there were a lot, like from Ethiopia, they're not treated well. So there's a lot of internal racism in Israel that if you're not part of like the class of the ruling elite, you're not going to be totally accepted there.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. There is racism, there is internal racism. But in my opinion, that racism stops being very significant when it comes to the racism against the Palestinian population, because then you're talking about a whole nother scope of dehumanization, of supremacy, of all of these things, really, because then between them, they will continue to have problems. As a matter of fact, even when you spoke about the Zionist movements who emigrated from Europe only, so let's say the initial Zionist movements, because they formed militias, armed militias, terrorist organizations, as the British used to describe them at the time, the Haganah, the Irgun, all of them. They used to fight between them over areas. They had fights between them over who controls where. And the year leading to the 7th of October has probably seen the highest level of division in Israel in its history after its formation, because there was a massive split in society with the whole judicial reforms from Benjamin Netanyahu and his plans to control the judicial system in Israel. And that led many people to think that he had some sort of prior knowledge about the 7th of October attacks, and he allowed them to happen. What's your personal take on that?
I know my wife and I discussed that. She's convinced also that the Israeli leadership knew about it and allowed it to happen. And there's a lot of evidence that would support such an argument. But if you look at the way Israel is performing their war in Gaza, something has to be said about rank incompetence as well. So the fact that people were sending up the pipeline information that they believed that Hamas was planning something doesn't necessarily mean that they were ignored because they wanted Hamas to attack, but they were just too stupid to realize what they were being told. I mean, if you look at the Netanyahu government and even previous Israeli governments, they really are not that intelligent. Otherwise, they would never be in this situation in the first place. And you see the same thing in the United States. I mean, with Biden promoting monies to Ukraine, which is a failed situation, and monies to Israel, and Israel, for all intents and purposes, is losing. They've had to retreat their settlers from the border with Gaza on the eastern side, as well as in the north, where they're being attacked by Hezbollah. And now they're starting to have issues in the West Bank. Now, admittedly, the West Bank resistance is not as large as Hamas because you have the PLA there. But they're coming together, and it could become explosive at some point. So for a country that's saying we're winning the war, you're losing a lot of land as a result of it. So I don't know if you can say that's sort of a win.
No, I don't think so at all. As a matter of fact, I think everything they do that they publish on mainstream media is primarily for domestic purposes, really, to raise the morale of a defeated army and a nation in mourning and loss, and a defeated nation, really, as a whole in Israel. You're talking about a country that hasn't faced such a thing in its history.
Well, if you look at how they're prosecuting the war with its formations in Gaza, even that doesn't make any sense. I wrote to you earlier, I said, if Israel is really interested in going after Hamas, they would never have invaded Gaza. They would have used elite special forces to go in and at least find out where the tunnel exits are. And these special forces would have probably been covered by larger forces like Ranger type units. But to go in with a land invasion in the way they have shows that militarily they have no interest in Hamas. They just want to kill the population. And in terms of warfare, that doesn't make much sense because you're leaving the actual capabilities to promote war from Hamas's side intact. Now, it's also most likely they can't find the Hamas strongholds and even cut off enough of the exit outlets from their tunnels to make them unusable. But nonetheless, you don't prosecute a situation like this, which is basically urban warfare, with a land invasion. And if we look at just the number of Merkava tanks that have been destroyed, either these tanks are poorly built, or Hamas has got one heck of a set of mine design that they can attach one to a Merkava and it just blows up. Or their 105 projectiles, which can...
They are very, very sophisticated. Yeah.
They pierce the armor and get in there. The other thing which people are not aware of is that most of the Merkava tanks are the Model 4. The latest model is the Model 5, and we don't have any reports as to the difference in their capabilities yet. We just know that Hamas is destroying a lot of these tanks. And I suspect even if they brought in U.S. Abrams tanks, it would be the same problem. because the Abrams is not faring well in Ukraine either. Territory it was actually designed to fight in.
Well, I mean, firstly, with regards to their capabilities, interesting you mentioned that because when you assess the attacks that they conduct against Israeli tanks, you see how effective their Yasin 105 particularly is with a double warhead, right? It causes a lot of damage. And again, you don't hear talks about the stats. Al-Qassam brigades, the Hamas military wing, so far they destroyed 1,200 Israeli machinery, 1,000 of which tanks. So that's why
that's like half their armor or 1/3 of their armor.
Exactly.
It's an amazing number.
Yeah, and they had to go back to the Merkava 4 because they destroyed the majority of the Merkava 5. And like they also resorted to using the M113 troop carrier from the Tiger carrier. That was supposed to be bulletproof, which signals that they took down all of them. And they're taking the M113 with basic RPG missiles, not even heat-guided missiles, really. But they will always cover that up.
Well, this shows, going back to the point of rank incompetence, this is showing a level of incompetence in military procurement that they didn't match their weapons with what could be in Gaza. They just went in with their masses and expected to roll over Hamas and the people. Since they couldn't get at Hamas, they're killing the people to demoralize Hamas. But if you use the World War II bombing raids as any indication, attacking a population only brings a population together. But British and American so-called bombing experts believe that if they bomb the civilian population in Germany, it would get them to turn on the government. And they didn't. They supported the government more.
Exactly. Look, I think the plan was genocide from the beginning, really. Israel spoke about, because you see a pattern. Like Israel had many escalations with Gaza. They had 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, several other escalations from them. The most significant ones were 2008, 2009, end of 2008, beginning of the 09, then 2014. In both of these wars, Israel declared publicly that they want to demolish the Hamas. In 2009, they started changing their objectives in the middle of the war. They said, we want to hurt their military capabilities when they knew they couldn't defeat them. And they were in many of the areas that they were in at the moment. Although now they took it to a different level in terms of how many areas they invade, regardless of how well established they are in these areas or not, because technically they're not really established in any city in Gaza. They have bases outside all of the major cities, temporary, that are constantly attacked. And the Palestinian resistance support always attacks their lines of supply, the chains of supply. They have very good intel as to where they go and come and where they're planning to attack them. And they deceive them a lot. That's why they have many successful attacks against them, whether they go in the houses or...
As Scott Ritter has said on several occasions, when you create rubble in a city, most of Gaza is residential, what have you. It's a major advantage to the defender because the defender knows the area like the back of their hands in the first place, and rubble is just a natural defense. And so they can become very easily entrenched. And this is why you hear about Hamas fighters taking positions in demolished buildings and taking out tanks and troop carriers and what have you, because they know how to use the terrain.
Yeah.
Israel has never really fought in urban warfare. It's basically been a land army relying on armor. And this is not your typical war that Israel has been involved in. Either in 1967, they attacked using the Air Force primarily. In 1973, it was armor, which they nearly lost. they came very close to losing to the Egyptians. A report I read at the time said that the mistake the Egyptians made was that they moved it beyond their missile umbrella, but they nearly destroyed, I think it was the Israeli 3rd Division armor. They were about to encircle it, but Israel was able to call in additional armored troops from the north just in time. But
I mean,
all of this is still land-based warfare. Now, even though they've been going into Gaza here and there, these have not been full-throated incursions. They've been like practicing, but they haven't learned anything. Because if you notice, each incursion got tougher and tougher for them. And it doesn't seem like they learned any lessons of what urban warfare is really like.
No, the only urban warfare they're used to is bullying and killing innocent civilians in the West Bank, is army against civilians.
So that's not urban warfare.
Yeah, exactly. That's not urban warfare, exactly. So they're used to bullying people, and they're implementing that on a mass scale in Gaza. Why? Because you have a very advanced military resistance. And from my perspective, they have the undeclared objectives. So their declared objectives are already a failure, demolishing Hamas, making Gaza, forcing Gaza not to pose a threat to Israel, and continuing to occupy Gaza as long as they want. But
even if they got into Gaza, let's say they push the people out either into Egypt, or now one of their plans that have come up that's being reported on is they're going to push them out through boats at that pier. Let's say they get rid of all the Palestinians, 2.3 million people. What's left? Hamas. Do they really think
interesting. Yeah.
Hamas lives underground. They have entire city-like infrastructure under there. Yeah, if some of their tunnel exits get destroyed, they'll build new ones.
That's a very interesting observation. And again, it reinforces and it highlights the notion that they are against the civilians. Otherwise, why would they make over 90% of the hospitals dysfunctional? Yeah. Why would they cut off water? Why would they cut off all of the aid? Why would they destroy wheat factories?
Because they're fanatics, and fanatics are only good for one thing in combat: cannon fodder. That's all they're doing. They're just throwing fanatics, or using their fanatical ideology to throw their arms at the people. But the problem is, they're not getting rid of the problem they claim they want to get rid of. Even if they committed, God forbid, a genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza, you're still going to have tens of thousands of highly trained irregulars underground.
Exactly.
What do you think they would do if that happened? I would let Israel rebuild everything on top and then destroy the whole place.
Exactly. But it just highlights how they think irrationally, really, and their whole purpose is to completely ethnically cleanse the population. How do you see? Because you're obviously America. How do you see the U.S. administration in all of this?
I agree with all the negative reporting about the administration. I mean, they're like the Israeli leadership. They're just as equally evil and incompetent. But I would have to disagree with Max Blumenthal on one thing with Anthony Blinken. Like Jake Sullivan and John Kirby, who are really soulless ghouls. When I see Anthony Blinken, I think this man's having a very hard time with this. I think he's being destroyed inside, and he's doing it because he has to do it. He might be in a position, as Max Blumenthal has said, where he's taken part in a lot of different things, but maybe this is one thing that he's having real trouble with, because when I see him, he looks like he's drained.
Yeah, I mean, he told Netanyahu, I see dead Palestinian kids in my sleep, because he has protests outside of his house 24/7 with the bodies of the
Yeah.
children in Gaza. So, I mean, any person with an ounce, 1% of humanity will feel soulless, really. You'll be empty from the inside.
I mean, Max is probably correct on this, because I would default to his expertise. But someone somewhere has to have some sense of humanity.
Do you think it will reach a point where the US would say we've had enough? I mean, you've had Schumer threatening to use leverage. You've had Blinken recently stating that your position globally will put you at a higher risk. It will increase you being secluded globally if you go in and invade Rafah. What's your take on that?
I don't think Israel really cares. I think that even if the Biden administration were to make sincere efforts at this point to stop it, I don't see these people stopping in Israel. I just see them going in and doing whatever they believe they've got to do. Even if the support stops, they'll use whatever they got to supposedly conquer Gaza. Remember, Israel is a major arms exporter. Now, they're not exporting fighters and probably not tanks at this point, but they must have enough industry to produce small arms, small missiles, and what have you, to keep them going for a little while.
Well, they're struggling with arms. They're clearly, visibly struggling with arms. I mean, one of the delays for the campaign in Rafah, really. Firstly, we saw since the temporary ceasefire broke, when Israel reignited the war again, because people forget, and it's also important to highlight that Israel actually signed the reactivation and restarting the war after the temporary ceasefire. But up until the temporary ceasefire, Israel had very significant bombardment, right? They're still bombing. They're still on a genocide campaign. They're still committing crimes against humanity. But the scale during the first 45 days was a little bit different. Then you had the Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant. He visited Israeli weapon manufacturers 2 months ago. And he said this war highlighted how much we need to produce our own weapons across all the board and not rely on anyone, which is signaling that the
that's what
US
I was
might,
saying.
yeah,
I was
which is
saying that
signaling that.
they're
Go ahead.
producing their own small arms, their own munitions. But what I think Gallant is referring to, we have to produce our own fighters, our own ships, our own hypersonic missiles, better tanks. I don't even think the Merkava is that popular in export, because I think the South Korean, there's a South Korean tank that is very popular, and it's like equivalent to one of the Russian tanks in terms of capabilities. I think it's even more popular than the M1 Abrams. But the Merkava obviously cannot withstand this type of close assault. And so I don't see the Merkava as a big export compared to, for instance, the South Korean tank or even the British Leopard.
But I don't think that they will necessarily succeed in filling the gap if the US administration were to. I'm not suggesting that they will, but if the US administration were to take a step back from supplying them with weapons, I don't think they'd be able to handle it for much longer. That's why I think the US has a lot of responsibility.
Oh, I completely agree with you. The other thing is that for the longest time, and I imagine right up to the outbreak of the Gaza conflict, the Israeli military was predicated on a 30-day war. This is like, since 1948, the longest conflict they've ever had. And at some point, their inherent reserves are going to run out. And yes, they can produce more small arms and more munitions, but not at the rate they're, like you said, they're using them at. But they'll probably continue nonetheless.
Yeah. And plus, what are they going to do with the Gazans? Clearly, the Palestinian resistance is still producing weapons. They're introducing new weapons to the battle during this war. And they previously stated back in 2021 that they continue the digging, extending the tunnel network, and they continue producing weapons. They released videos of them producing weapons during the war. And what are you going to do with that exactly? If you're planning to control the land, what are you going to do? Produce more tanks to be bombed more by these handmade?
That's what I was saying earlier. Let's say they push everyone out. Well, Hamas is still there.
Hamas is still there, exactly.
And what are they going to do? Build apartment buildings on top of Hamas strongholds?
Yeah, exactly. They'll pop out from it. As a matter of fact, they might make it easier for them, because even if they want to flatten everything and they expel everyone, and you still have these people in the networks, what are you going to do, really? There is no escaping.
There's no way that, given the capabilities that Hamas have shown in the last 5 months, that Israel is going to conquer Gaza in terms of eliminating the actual combat capability of the Palestinian people, unless they nuke the place. But I mean, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen because they're going to affect themselves. Yeah. But otherwise, they would consider it. They said it already. Amichai Eliyahu, who's a minister in the government, part of the Otzma Yehudit party, Jewish power, that belongs to the Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he stated we need to nuke Gaza. He said it needs to be an option. And guess what? They didn't take out of the government. And they didn't deny that they have nuclear weapons.
I would say, go ahead and see what happens. You think you're being ostracized now? Use a nuclear bomb. I guarantee you, you'll be isolated for the rest of your existence.
Yeah. What do you think of Canada banning the arms sales to Israel?
Well, I think it's a pretty good bill that's coming out of the Canadian Parliament. I don't understand how it got passed, given Justin Trudeau's lapdog status to the WEF and Friends with Israel stuff. But it's an amazing bill to make it through the Canadian Parliament. I don't know how much Canada exports to Israel, but whatever it is, it's not going there anymore. And Ireland has basically cut off the transfer of weapons over Irish land routes or ports or airspace.
Well, so Canada was one of the top 10 for Israel. It was reported to be one of the top 10, and it was quite significant. I think personally it's a good move, really, because you had the Netherlands previously stopping the shipments for parts for the F-35.
Yeah.
And I think it's proving to be a domino effect, really, with countries. But the question is, what will happen with the US? To conclude, what do you think? What do you think the situation is like at the moment, and how much does the shift in public opinion can actually force the US government to actually do something? Because many people feel like, I'm protesting, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but we're seeing no action. They're still supporting them. Do you think it will change at some point? Do you think it's taking its effect?
I think it's going to take effect in the election this year. I don't see it having any immediate effect. I mean, Biden himself, as far as I can see, doesn't know what planet he's on, and the administration officers he has seem to be all in with helping Israel. The U.S. House just passed I think $4 billion aid bill to Israel under Mike Johnson. I don't know if it'll pass the Senate. So I don't see activism really working here. I think Israel in this case is doing more against itself than the activists can do. I think Israel's fanatical attacks on Gaza, it really has some people in the administration quite concerned. So if anything, if they do go into Rafah, there is a possibility that U.S. will just cut them off. But who knows?
Do you think that actually exists, that option, that the U.S. will cut them off?
Well, for the longest time, Biden's been saying there's no daylight between us and Israel, which is basically a treasonous statement since he's giving preference to a foreign country. But he might be pushed into doing it. I mean, you've had a number of resignations out of the State Department. There are other rumblings inside various agencies. I don't think every intelligence agency is on board with this, despite what people might believe. They know what can happen. They've run all the scenarios. But I wouldn't give it the best odds. When people are on a script, they're going to stay on it. I mean, we're talking about a sociopathology which can't be cured.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in America, politicians are sociopathic, just like the Israeli leadership is sociopathic. They follow a script, and that's why nothing's ever changed in this country, and why nothing's going to change in Israel.
Is Trump going to be back in power?
Unless something really strange happens, I would say yes. I would say he'll.
Do you see him? Let's say the war continues, this genocide, and Netanyahu is still in power. How do you think he will approach it? Because he constantly says that if I were the president, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. If I was the president, Israel wouldn't have done this, and Hamas wouldn't have done that, as if he controls the whole world, right?
Yes.
But what do you think will change if he's in power?
Well, with Trump, like Aaron Mate has said, there's a random factor with him. For all we know, his positive statements on Israel could just be a bluff, and maybe he really hates these people and will pull the rug out from underneath them. But who knows? I mean, he's made similar statements to RFK Jr., which has cost RFK Jr. a lot of voters. And I suspect if Trump keeps on making these statements, he's going to land up with the same situation. But if once in office, I don't know. I mean, Trump talks a big line, but and some of his instincts are correct, but his follow through hasn't been stellar. And his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is being reported that he's eyeing a beachfront property in Gaza. So there you have it.
To that level, yeah.
Good go.
Don't think that's gonna happen. Cool.
No.
We'll wrap it then. Steve Naidamast, thank you so much for joining me in the show. And that's it for you guys, and we'll see you soon in the next Modcast.